In the news tonight, His Majesty the King holds talks with world leaders in New York on the need for coordinated efforts in the fight against radicalism, as well as increased international support to Syrian refugees. The NATO chief calls for deconfliction in Syria and voices hope that Russia's increased presence in the country would not create problems in the fight against Daesh. And Ecuador's President Rafael Correa slams developed nations on immigration policy during his speech to the UN in New York, calling their policies shameful. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news. His Majesty King Abdullah continues to hold talks with leaders in New York ahead of his scheduled address to the UN General Assembly meeting tomorrow. Late yesterday, His Majesty met with President of Panama, Juan Carlos Varela, on economic cooperation and trade exchange, as well as a host of regional issues, including the crisis in Syria, Iraq, and Israeli aggression in Jerusalem and its violation of Al-Aqsa Mosque. They underlined the need for security coordination in the fight against terror and for the international community to stand up to its responsibilities towards the influx of Syrian refugees. Separately, King Abdullah received Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama, and again the meeting reviewed ways to combat radicalism through spreading the true image of Islam. King Abdullah voiced full support to Albanian efforts to build a regional center to spread the culture of tolerance. In a meeting with President of Gabon, Ali Bongo Ondimba, His Majesty also discussed the importance of continued security coordination among various international stakeholders to fight extremism. Ondimba, for his part, valued the humanitarian role Jordan is playing towards Syrians fleeing the war in their country. Clashes erupted between Israeli police and Palestinians at Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, where violence has continued during the past weeks. Palestinian youth threw rocks at police in riot gear, who responded with rubber bullets. A statement by the White House expressed deep concern about the violence at the site, calling on all sides to exercise restraint and refrain from provocative actions and rhetorics. An Israeli soldier smashed the camera of an AFP journalist as he covered clashes between the army and Palestinian youth near the West Bank city of Nablus, following the funeral of a Palestinian who was shot by Israeli troops last week. The Israeli army said it has suspended an officer in charge of a group of Israeli soldiers who argued with the journalist after one of the soldiers smashed his camera. The incident was documented in a video shot by Palestinian network Palmedia. In New York, meanwhile, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation Contact Group on Al-Quds held an emergency meeting to discuss Israeli violation in Al-Aqsa Mosque. Minister of Foreign and Expatriate Affairs Nasser Joudeh attended the meeting, where he reiterated Jordan's stand that occupied Jerusalem, which houses Islamic and Christian holy sites, is a red line. He said that Jordan will use every diplomatic and legal means to protect holy shrines in the occupied city based on the Hashemite custodianship, adding that the kingdom, as member in the UN Security Council, will work to make null and void all Israeli measures against Al-Aqsa Mosque. He again voiced Jordan's full rejection of Israeli attempt to impose a temporal and spatial division of Al-Aqsa Mosque. Yemeni President Abdel Rabbo Mansour Hadi toured the war-torn southern port city of Aden over the weekend, meeting with Gulf coalition troops guarding the city and with Yemeni tribal leaders and officials. From behind the secured grounds of Aden's Al Qasr Hotel, the temporary home of President Hadi after his return from Saudi Arabia last week, Hadi met with tribal leaders and local officials from Yemen's Abyan and Lahaj province. Meanwhile, airstrikes by helicopters from a Saudi-led alliance killed 25 people in a Yemeni village. These strikes in the village of Bani Zela come a day after Saudi Arabia announced that 3 of its officers, including a general, were killed along the frontier. Jordan, meanwhile, has voiced its full rejection of a report by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights on the humanitarian situation in Yemen, which said that the Saudi-led coalition forces committed humanitarian rights violation in Yemen and targeted civilian as well as civilian facilities in the country. Minister of Foreign Expatriate Affairs Nasser Joudeh said in a statement on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly that Jordan, as member of the coalition that aims to restore legitimacy in Yemen, affirms that operations of the coalition forces came upon the request of the legitimate government of Yemen and its president Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi. The operation, he added, are also part of a commitment to the UN Security Council Resolution 2216, and that the ultimate goal of the coalition is to protect the Yemenis from violation being committed against them. And over to the Syria crisis, Russian President Vladimir Putin has branded U.S. support for rebel forces in Syria as illegal and ineffective, saying U.S.-trained rebels were leaving to join Daesh with weapons supplied by Washington. In an interview with U.S. networks recorded ahead of a meeting with U.S. President Barack Obama, Putin said Syrian President Bashar al-Assad deserved international support as he was fighting terrorist organizations. Obama and Putin are scheduled to meet again tomorrow after Putin addresses the United Nations. Also in New York, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said he's confident that ongoing talks between the U.S. and Russia would help clear the air about Russia's intention in Syria after its recent build-up at an air base near Latakia. He called for deconfliction in Syria and voiced hope that Russia's increased presence in the country would not create problems in the fight against Daesh.
I welcome that there are already, and there are going to be also more talks, contacts between the United States and Russia addressing the challenges in Syria. And I would also urge Russia to play a constructive and cooperative role in fighting ISIL. To support Assad is not a constructive contribution to finding a solution in the crisis in Syria. There is a need at least to deconflict the presence of Russian military forces in Syria and the presence of coalition forces fighting ISIL.
The U.S.-led coalition conducted 20 airstrikes against Daesh in Iraq and 3 against the terrorist group in Syria during the past 24 hours. According to a statement released by the Combined Joint Task Force today, the coalition conducted 5 strikes in Iraq near the town of Heat, where it destroyed a facility for making vehicle bombs and command and control facility in one of the group's headquarters. In a separate statement issued later, the coalition said it also conducted airstrikes in Iraq near Qubbasa, where it hit parts of a cement factory that it said Daesh was using to house fighters, equipment and weapons. In Syria, these strikes hit and destroyed targets near Al-Hasake, Abu Kamal and Mar'a, while French airstrikes destroyed a terrorist training camp near Deir ez-Zor. French President François Hollande said at the UN meeting in New York that 6 French jets have destroyed targets in Syria and warned of more strikes in coming weeks. On the ground in Syria, meanwhile, the Observatory for Human Rights said a week-old ceasefire agreement in northwest Syria appeared to hold today after it was violated for the first time overnight. Under the Iranian and Turkish-backed ceasefire, warring sides agreed to cease hostilities in at least 2 villages in the northwestern province of Idlib and a town near the Lebanese border for up to 6 months. During that time, insurgent fighters are to withdraw from the border town of Zabadani, where they are surrounded by pro-government forces. In return, civilians would be evacuated from the Shiite village of Al-Fua and Kifriya in Idlib, which are under rebel siege. As Europe contends with a refugee crisis, with an estimated 1 million people expected to seek asylum in Europe this year as they escape from war-torn countries in the Middle East and North Africa, world leaders at the UN General Assembly meeting are addressing Europe's migrant policies. Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa slammed developed nations on immigration policy during his speech to the UN in New York, calling their policies shameful. He said that while the free movement of goods and capital in the search for the highest profitability is promoted, the free movement of people looking for dignified work is penalized, stressing that the migration policies of rich countries are truly shameful, Carrera told the UN. Earlier, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro blamed the refugee crisis in Europe on unjust wars. He said this is the most tragic and painful mass migration known to humanity in the 70-year history of the United Nations. Meanwhile, to deliver a message to politicians, thousands of people marched in solidarity with refugees in a national demonstration in the Belgian capital, Brussels. Organized by the Civic Platform in support for Brussels refugees, the Refugee Welcome March attracted crowds waving banners and playing drums to show their support for those escaping war. Spokesperson Elodie Francard said the demonstration aimed at showing popular support to the migrant to politicians.
The goal of this march is really to show great solidarity so that politicians understand that a slice of the population is in favor of immigration, in favor of the arrival of these new migrants, and in favor of taking care of these refugees in a dignified way.
Earlier in the week, EU leaders pledged at least €1 billion for Syrian refugees in the Middle East and closer cooperation to stem the migrant flow into Europe. A record 433,000 refugees and migrants have crossed the Mediterranean to Europe in 2015, more than double the total for all of 2014. This morning, 17 migrants drowned when their boat sank off the Turkish coast while headed to the Greek island of Kos. Pope Francis capped his first full day in Philadelphia by praying with a crowd of some 1 million people gathered at the annual World Festival of Families. The event drew celebrities such as actor Mark Wahlberg, singer Aretha Franklin, and the rock band The Fray. He also met with prison inmates that made a hand-carved wooden chair he will later use during a mass that's expected to draw more than 1 million people. Here's a wrap of his activities.
The Pope, who has championed the rights of immigrants, began the day by boarding a helicopter and flying over New York's most prominent symbols of immigration, the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. Then he headed to Philadelphia to greet the largest crowds of his U.S. tour. He celebrated Mass at the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul and urged lay members of the church to become more involved.
We know that the future of the church in a rapidly changing society will call, and even now calls, for a much more active engagement on the part of the laity.
At a Philadelphia seminary, he asked young students to perform a special song for the city's Archbishop, Charles Chaput.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Later, the Pope went to Independence Hall, where he said the country's religious freedom enables Americans to live peacefully with those of different faiths.
The ideal of interreligious dialogue, where all men and women of different religious traditions may dialogue without fighting each other. That is what religious freedom gives us.
The Pope ended his day at the annual Festival of Families, where he told a crowd of some 1 million people that the family is the most important thing in the world.
Pero lo más lindo
But the most beautiful thing
que hizo Dios,
that God did,
dice la Biblia,
says the Bible,
fue la familia.
was the family.
On Sunday, he'll visit a local prison and then celebrate Mass with the largest crowd of his U.S. visit. Some 1.5 million people are expected to attend.
We begin with tennis. Poland's Agnieszka Radwanska beat rising star Belinda Bencic 6-2, 6-2 in the final of the Pan Pacific Open in Tokyo, Japan, to capture her first WTA title in more than a year and return to the world's top 10 rankings. The 26-year-old Radwanska turned in a near-flawless display against Bencic, snatching 28 winners past the Swiss teenager to win her second Pan Pacific Open and her first WTA title since last year's Roger Cup in Montreal. The 18-year-old had been in great form all week, defeating Gabriela Muguruza and Caroline Wozniacki on the way to the final, and would have cracked the top 10 herself had she won. Lewis Hamilton won the Japanese Grand Prix in Suzuka to equal the late Ayrton Senna's tally of 41 Formula One victories and move 48 points clear of Mercedes teammate Nico Rosberg with 5 races remaining. On a sunny afternoon at Suzuka, in marked contrast to the dark and tragic 2014 race that he also won, the double world champion seized the lead from pole sitter Rosberg at the start and never looked back. Hamilton now has 277 points to Rosberg's 229, with Vettel dropping back to 218, but refusing to give up his championship hopes until mathematically ruled out. And finally, fair weather continues in most regions tonight, with partly cloudy skies and northwesterly light to moderate winds. Similar conditions prevail in hilly areas tomorrow, while it will be relatively hot in the Badia and the Jordan Valley, with northwesterly moderate to brisk winds. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect relatively hot conditions tomorrow, with northerly moderate to brisk winds and slightly choppy seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. And to end the news, here's a recap of our top stories. His Majesty the King holds talks with world leaders in New York on the needs for coordinated efforts in the fight against radicalism, as well as increased international support to Syrian refugees. The NATO chief calls for deconfliction in Syria and voices hopes that Russia's increased presence in the country would not create problems in the fight against Daesh. And Ecuador's President Rafael Correa slams developed nations on immigration policy during his speech to the UN in New York, calling their policies shameful. And with this we come to an end. I'm Farah Ajlouni. Thank you for watching and have a good night.